And then, yes, we will be recording the event. All right, looks like we have a good group of folks joining us, so let's get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chåson History Society Zoom Talk series. My name is Heejin Lee. I will be the moderator of today's talk. On behalf of the Chåson History Society, I want to thank you all for joining in today's online event. And most importantly, I want to thank our speaker, Spencer Lee-Lenfield, for giving us a wonderful opportunity to hear his work on Younghill Kang and his incorporation of Inset poetry in English translation. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me first provide a little context on the Chåson History Society, the mission of our organization, and what we do. Chåson History Society is a public, learned society that promotes the study, research, and teaching of Korea's past. Our goal is to foster an active community of researchers and learners of Korea's past. We connect scholars working both outside and inside the professional academy across the disciplines. We bring together scholars, artists, antiquarians, writers, content creators, and interested generalists from around the world. Moreover, we aim to provide opportunities for scholars who are operating independently or are otherwise under-resourced to network and share their work. We have multiple ongoing projects, online public talks, a translation and consulting network. So please stay tuned for our upcoming project, the Global Chåson Initiative. We encourage you to visit our official website to get to know more about our directors and projects. And if I could, if you want to look in the chat, there is the link to the website for our organization. One thing I want to give a pitch for that is very new and recent is that we have a membership drive right now and also voting on the best English language article in pre-modern Korea, I believe. And there are 4 nominations that have been put up by a selection committee, and those will be, they are up for voting by members only. And so if you want to go ahead and sign up for the membership, you are welcome to vote. And the winner of the prize, the best English language article prize, will receive $300 in as prize money. So we want to celebrate good scholarship by folks inside and outside the academy. So please visit our website and have a look. All right. Moving on. If you see on the website just before moving on, we also accept donations. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. So please see the website for more. All right, so without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Spencer Lee-Lenfield. Spencer is an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. They are currently adapting their dissertation, This Beauty Born of Parting, Literary Translation Between Korean and English via the Korean Diaspora, 1920 to the Present, into a monograph. Other recent research has appeared in publications including Criticism, PMLA, Poetics Today, Narrative, Modern Language Quarterly. This presentation borrows from an article scheduled for publication in the Journal of Korean Studies in 2027. Please welcome Spencer Lee-Lenfield. Spencer, you may unmute yourself and share your slide screen for the talk.
Okay, great. I will try to start with exactly that. And let's see, if I choose Google Chrome, CHS slides. All right, how is that?
Looks great.
Fantastic. And let's see, I have multiple monitors going here. So, all right, wonderful. And I would like to also add, by way of starting, so that I misunderstood the time request of the lecture. So total time, so as lecture time, so and not the other way around. So if this runs a little bit on the long side, please do forgive me. I'm going to work to compress on the fly. So and I think that it should come in not too bad. So but it might be slightly on the longer than not side. Uh, Thank you to everyone so much for the opportunity to join today, and especially to Isongji for inviting me, and to Hijin Lee for moderating and responding. I've really been looking forward to the opportunity to get to share this work, which is going to be out in article form, as was mentioned, in probably fall of next year. Uh, in a special issue of JKS that's going to be edited by Susan Hong and Shin Hae-rin on Korea and translation. So a lot of the talk today is also going to appear in that article. But I'm really grateful for this wonderful opportunity to circulate the ideas early, and especially with an audience who can respond to both the pre-industrial and the 20th century sides of the project. So I hope that you'll tolerate a certain amount of article soundingness in my delivery today. But first, I also wanted to mention a little bit about what brought me to Kang and to this article. I started looking into Kang because I was interested in the poet Han Yong-on, and the more I dug into the history of attempts to translate Han's poetry in English, the more I realized that there's a really deep backstory behind his translation, together with his wife, whose name was Frances Keeley, in 1970 of Nimei Timuk under the title Meditations of the Lover. A lot of people just view or dismiss this translation as frankly weird and not very accurate, which might be true in part. But I realized when I read The Grass Roof, the text at the center of the talk today, that Kang definitely understood Han Yong-won just fine, and that when he wanted to, he could translate him into normal looking, accurate English. So the story of why his translations went from conventionally fluent to really wild over 4 decades became the first chapter in my dissertation, which I've now adapted into a book and I'm starting to query publishers about. So the research for this article grew out of that chapter, but it's also very separate from it. I realized that there's just a lot about Kang that could not fit in any one document. He's a really surprisingly rich writer, and because of when he lived, his work brings together late Chåson Korea, early modern Korea under occupation, and the history of Koreans writing in English in an almost unique way. So this article is quite separate, and I also hope that I can work on ways to bring some of Kang's neglected or rare writing back into print. I'll mention some of that writing as I go along, and if any of you have any ideas about that, I'd be really grateful for thoughts or suggestions. So let me start by offering an overview of Younghill Kang's life for those of you who might only know his name in passing. So I imagine probably a few of you on this call know him quite well too. Then I'll jump into the problem at the heart of the article and this talk's title. Um, and hopefully, so I won't be too badly over time at that point. So first of all, Kang was basically the first Korean to win mass commercial success as an English language writer. There were definitely other Koreans who wrote in Korean from the US prior to Kang, like Chon Nak-chung, who's drawn a lot of attention lately. And there were also some Koreans who were writing in English, including, for example, Seo Jae-pil's Hansu's Journey in 1922. But no one got famous as a novelist prior to Kang. Early efforts to narrate the history of Korean American literature, like Elaine Kim's, generally took Kang's novel as their starting point. She didn't especially like Kang. She thought that he was both too aristocratic and too apolitical, though lately I think scholars have started to find his stories a little bit more complicated than that initial impression. There's a slightly circular problem with Kang's scholarship, too, where a lot of what we know about his early life comes from his autobiographical, but usually fictionalized self depiction in his own novels. But there's also enough independent corroboration in the archive, including from at least one school friend who knew him when he was young, to be able to speak about what we know did happen. So Kang's best biographer so far has been Kim Uk-dong, whose biography of Kang in Korean does a lot of really wonderful spade work in figuring out these details. So Kang was born around the end of the 19th century in a village outside Hamhung in Korea's north. He left Korea on missionary sponsorship around 1920 to pursue educational activities in North America. So first he went to Dalhousie University, which is in Nova Scotia, and after a year there, he moved to Boston. So it's just the phase of his life that you see here on the slides. He started it at BU. Then he finished a bachelor's degree there in 1925. And then he attended Harvard for a 1 year master's degree in English education. So then you see a document from that time, his application over here. Uh, he bounced around for a few years after he graduated, working odd jobs, which include a department store, hawking encyclopedias, and somehow he eventually found work teaching classical East Asian literatures as a lecturer at NYU in their Department of English and Comparative Literature. And you see here a record from their course catalog of some of the classes that he taught during that time. Really remarkable that he was doing this in the late 1920s. It was probably a good deal for NYU because people who had actually been trained as literati and literary synodic who could also teach in English weren't in huge supply in that era. And it might be worth comparing Kang's success supporting himself in this regard to people like Hu Shi, Park No-young, or Lin Yutang, so around the same time, all kind of the aristocratic or well-off Asians of means, kind of making a living on the lecture circuit as experts on Asia. Uh, Kang was probably one of the relatively few Koreans doing this. As some of you know, Park No-young kind of passed himself off as Chinese in a bit to kind of market himself. It's also noteworthy that Kang abandoned earlier plans when he first came to become a doctor or a scientist, which is way more common an ambition, of course, for Koreans who had the means to study in Japan or the US. You might think of characters like Ok-myung and Wansa at the end of Hyorenu in 1906, or in Lee Kwang-soo's Mudong, the characters of Hyung-sik and Sun-hyung, who can leave for educational prospects are planning things that clearly contributed to Korea's advancement in really tangible scientific and technological ways. So while Kang is at NYU, a few important things happen. First of all, he's translating a lot of poetry into English. Uh, it's possible that he was doing this to use as his own textbook. And there's this book that you see here called Translations of Oriental Poetry that appears on most timelines and bibliographies of Kang's life. But the thing is, there's very little research on this book, really one article, and it's very hard to find because, as far as I can tell, there's only one copy of it that still exists. Kang always was listing it on his CV, but it's entirely possible it was never really published. He claimed, as you can see here on the cover, that it was published by Prentice Hall, but when you look at it, it looks like it's just a copy off a typescript. This is what all of the material looks like. Fortunately, at least for me, the one copy that seems to survive is in Harvard's library system, and I'm trying very hard to keep it safe at the moment. If anyone would be interested in a PDF copy, please feel free to contact me. I'm really trying hard to get this to be better known. In the long term, I'd really like to republish this in a kind of critical edition, something like Timothy Billings' recent editions of Pound's Cafe and Victor Segolet's Stelle. If anyone has ideas about that, I'd be quite grateful too. The book itself is really interesting and relates to kind of the story of the article. Kang translated 147 pages of poems from literary Sinitic, pre-modern Korean, and classical Japanese. Uh, I think that I have some examples here. Yeah, the Chinese poems are generally well known. Most of them are from the Shijing, or the 300 Tang poems. The Korean poems are mainly Shijol, which I'll come back to later in this talk. They relate to the grass roof. What's surprising is that Kang knew enough classical Japanese to be able to translate classical poems from collections like the Manyoshu. He claimed that he spent some time studying Japan, though it's unclear whether that's true or not. And later in life, he translated a modern Japanese novel into English. It's especially interesting that he's doing all of this at a time when a lot of the East Asian poetry in English is being translated by people like Pound or Witter Binner or Arthur Waley. And even then, most of that is from Chinese or Japanese. I think it's very likely that Kang was one of the first people to translate Shijul into English, apart from missionaries writing in very small publications like James Gale. And Kang was certainly one of the first, probably the first Korean person to be doing so into English himself. It's a really early, unusual case of what some people call outbound translation. So, so this is a table. I realize this is probably too small to look at, but this is a table of the sources of as much of the poetry in this collection that I could track down the sources for as I could find. As you can see, it's still a work in progress, but this just gives you a kind of scale of what's involved. So the other important thing that happens while Kang is at NYU is that he makes friends with another lecturer teaching English there, so who is a Southerner by the name of Thomas Wolfe. And so soon after they meet, Wolfe publishes his first novel, and that becomes a huge success. And that gives him the standing to be able to introduce Kang to his editor, Maxwell Perkins. Uh, who himself was a major literary figure of the time. Perkins was of high enough standing that he could more or less publish whom he wanted, and the writers whose careers he built included F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, the other people you see in the photo. And so Kang is incredibly ambitious. There are great anecdotes from other Koreans of the era who were living in New York at the same time, and roommates in the YMCA who have these absurd memories of him pacing his room at the middle of the night, rambling grandiosely about how he was going to be as great a writer as Shakespeare. And it's just huge amounts of chutzpah from a Korean immigrant who is planning to write in his fourth language. So, somewhat shockingly, because he makes friends with Tom Wolfe, he actually gets this opportunity to publish somewhere really big. Kang seems to have thought of himself mainly as a poet in the mid 1920s, which is why he's translating all this poetry. But then, as now, poetry doesn't sell books. So he pitches Perkins on a novel, which is an autobiographical novel about his early life in Korea, the Japanese invasion, and then the March 1st movement. Perkins takes it, and that's what becomes The Grass Roof, which is the text at the center of the talk today. So The Grass Roof has two halves. Its first half depicts the life of its protagonist, whose name is Han Chong-pa, who's kind of an amiably burnished autobiographical stand-in for Kang himself. And he lives in an idyllic version of Korea before Japanese annexation. That section of the novel is autoethnographic. It's focused on explaining or depicting, sharing Korean culture with an English-speaking world that knew very, very little about Korea at that point. He spends long passages on things like funeral customs, Lunar New Year celebrations, childhood games. And the second half of the novel happens after the Japanese annexed Korea in 1910. So the main character, Han Chong-pa, leaves his village to hunt for a modern-style education against the backdrop of colonization and the Korean independence movement. Han spends time in Japan studying, goes back to Korea, tries to go back to his hometown, but realizes he won't have any future there. And then he makes up his mind to return to Seoul. He participates in the Samil Undong, and then after being released from prison, he comes to the conclusion that he needs to study in the United States to advance Korea's future. And the novel ends after he narrowly wins passage on a ship bound for New York City. Again, you can kind of think of the precedents set by Woo Jong or Hyorenu in that regard. So until 1945, Kang was arguably the most famous Korean writer, not just in the United States, but also Europe, because The Grass Roof was translated and published in 10 different European countries. And you see some of those translations here. He won a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1933 on the strength of The Grass Roof, which allowed him to then go on to write a second novel, East Goes West, which you see at right there, in 1937. And that novel focuses more on his time as a student and migrant in the US. And that's the one that's drawn way more attention from scholars in Asian American studies. Penguin republished East Goes West in 2019, whereas The Grass Roof went out of print in the 1950s, and it's really hard to find now outside libraries. Though I think that you can read it online through Half the Trust or something like that. So Kang's life after this turns into a much sadder story, unfortunately. He's fine until the start of the 1940s, but after the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, he goes to work for the military as a Japanese instructor for American troops. You can see his kind of enlistment card on the left there. So after the Japanese surrender, he spends a few years returning to Korea, and he writes articles in both English and Korean. You see one of the English ones here. And on the next slide, this is an example of some of the writing that he was actively doing in Korea in the 1940s, much of which is available on databases, but still has yet to be republished or gathered anywhere. But Kang is incredibly pessimistic about the situation of Korea after the war, and his wife and kids are still in the U.S. He was totally ineffective, or he was uninterested in being any kind of politician. But despite that fact, Sungman Rhee is incredibly jealous of him because he's one of the few Koreans that the Americans know and can communicate with, other than Rhee himself, and Rhee viewed that as a threat. So Kang and his children later alleged that Lee Sung-man leaked Kang's name to the FBI as a potential communist to discredit him. And that made it impossible for Kang to return to work inside a university during the Red Scare. So he goes back to the US. He has to take a bunch of odd jobs, lecturing at places like Rotary clubs. His editor, Maxwell Perkins, unfortunately dies in 1947, which means that no one left at Scribner's will take a look at his manuscripts anymore. He keeps trying to write and translate things, so mostly eccentric stuff, including a play that he called Murder in the Royal Palace, which was set during the Goryeo Dynasty. And Kim Uk-dong seems to have the only remaining copy of that. If anyone knows of any others, I'd be very curious. At the end of the Second World War, excuse me, so at the end of his lifetime, he and his wife managed to publish their translation of Han Yong-un together in 1970. Kang gets one last hurrah because he's invited to the Penn International Congress in Seoul that year, and Sorbet gives him an honorary degree. His wife dies the next year, and Kang falls to pieces. He lapses into alcoholism. Somewhat oddly, he moves to Florida at the last second, and he dies there in 1972. After he dies, he leaves all of his books to, I believe, Korea University. He then falls into obscurity for a long time, but he starts drawing attention in the 1990s as a kind of early Korean American and Asian American writer. Which is great, but it's also meant that there's a tendency to look at Kang mainly through the lens of American culture and overlook a lot of the sides of his writing that are formed by Korean culture in general and Korean literature in particular. And that's really what I try to focus on in this article. So the first thing that you notice when you open The Grass Roof is just within pages, there's a weirdly high amount of poetry quoted all over. He quotes 65 poems over the course of 367 pages, not counting the English poems that he uses as epigraphs to every chapter. And so by the standards of the Western or the English novel, it's just a really weird amount of poetry to quote over and over again. There's a scholar named Jane Im who wrote an article in studies on the novel about the sheer amount of poetry that Kang quotes in both his novels. And you can read the quote here. But she focuses completely on the English poems that Kang cites. She arrives at this reading of Kang as someone who was highly influenced by Western literature and felt this kind of Harold Bloom-esque anxiety of influence around it, which she reads as a kind of Meijin Han, uh, in front of the aura of the Western writers he venerates. And I can definitely understand how you might arrive at that reading by focusing on East Goes West over the grass roof and focusing on the English poets over the Asian ones. But I also think that that's only half the story. When you look at his translations of Korean and literary Semitic poetry, it's clear that Kang really wants to share this non-Western tradition so much that he's shoehorning Asian poetry really aggressively at the reader, just everywhere he can justify. And on top of that, he's doing it in his own words as a translator himself from Asia. And the other part of this puzzle, which is a little bit more subtle, is that I think that this kind of aggressive inclusion of poetry came in part from the model of how traditional East Asian fiction uses poetry as a device within the texture of prose narration. And so, as many of you may know, including from the title of the talk, the term that Korean critics have used for this habit over the past 50 plus years is sabipsi. So, as I imagine many of you already know, sabipsi appear with great frequency. So, in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese literature prior to European literary influence. The Chinese term is shimun hongjap or shiwen humsa. And the Japanese tend to call it uta monogatari, so sort of song stories. But these terms basically refer to the same phenomenon. Uh, these kinds of sabipsi appear all over Tang Dynasty era Tanxi, or Tales of the Strange, which is the genre that seems to inspire prose fiction across the region more broadly. And they seem to have first entered Korean prose fiction in the 15th century, together with fiction set in Korea itself, Kim Si-seup's Kumo and then sabipsi stay a feature of Korean literature in both vernacular Korean and Hanmun to the end of the 19th century, including any of the best known fiction of the era. I'm sure that many of you know the Kuunmong, the Umyeongjong, the Ch'unhyangjŏn, so all of these. And so when you look at Kang's writing as deliberately drawing techniques from Asian literature, it really starts to look more like he's developing a kind of hybrid structure that incorporates aspects from both literary traditions into a combination novel. It's an autobiographical novel, so it's very Western, so it's very long. It speaks to an English reader as if from outside Korean culture. But at the same time, it also builds in all this poetry. It contains a lot of Korean and Semitic literature within itself. It's very intertextual. And in ways beyond what I had room to actually mention in the article, it obeys or uses a number of genre conventions around things like heroism, intelligence, romance that you recognize in the Chåson Soso too. So here's an example from page 91 of The Grass Roof. Uh, in Songdongji, after the Dragon Festival, summer was in full swing. This festival commemorated Chu Yuan, the great Chinese minister who committed suicide because his prince would not take his advice in the 4th century before Christ. As we boys danced singly, taking what steps our souls prompted, we kept up the simple refrain, 좋다, 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 happy, 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 to the varying music of the orchestra. One song which we were all very fond of singing to the accompaniment of the Pine Grove Orchestra was the Korean folk air, Green mountains are natural, natural. Blue water is natural, natural. Natural mountains, natural streams, mountains above me, rivers around me. I too am natural, natural. Here where a natural body was grown, even old age will be natural, natural. And this brief note at the end, then the narrative texture continues. So the song that Kang translates here is poem 462 in the Cheonggul Yeongwon, the earliest collection of Sijou from 1728. And later sources attribute this to the poet Song Sial. You can see it quoted here on the side. 청산도 절로 절로, so 녹수도 절로 절로, etc. It's worth pausing a moment here to look at some of the details about how Kang is translating. So you can see that he's striving to reproduce the effect of that uh, rhythmically reduplicating 자료 by repeating natural, natural, but not too strictly. So because he wants those lines to come out looking even, he reduces this effect to just like natural mountains, natural streams by line 3, and to convey the sense of the caesura in the middle of each of the Shicho lines, here and in his other translations, each Korean line is becoming two English ones. But this is a Safa Shicho, and Kang makes an important exception here for that sense of added length in the Zhongjang line. He adds this kind of indented I too am natural, natural. So, which might also convey some kind of aspect of sung performance. It's now been lost to time. So, in a note after the title page of The Grass Roof, Kang wrote he and his wife, whom he credited as a collaborator, believed in this carrying over the spirit, the aesthetic pattern, and the literal meaning from the original. And this is very much in keeping with how other translators of that era, you again think of Pound, you think of Witter-Binner, they often express the same goals, even though our own way of thinking about translation since then has really long complicated the idea of literal meaning. I'm not sure any translator would talk that way anymore. But Hang's mission statement also voices what he wants to share of Korean poetry with the world. He wanted to share its basic denotations, but he also wanted to share its forms and its spirit. And so that mission relies not just on the poem itself, but its placement inside some kind of narrative context. The reader has to understand that this text lived not just as words on a page, but as choral song in a social context. So the interpretive work that he's doing by embedding the poem in the story is itself anthropologically complex here. And unusually for the time period, it's also emic rather than Edic. So the argument that I make in the article is that the convention of inset poetry that he inherited from traditional, by which I mean pre-Kabul-Kehyok, a prose fiction, gave him a model for incorporating his translations of East Asian poetry into the grass roof. So we know from evidence internal to the novel that he knew of at least two works in particular. He knew of the Kuunmong and the Ch'unhyangjŏn. So I read his portrayal of those two fictions, along with their respective uses of sabipsi, to try to reconstruct how he saw sabipsi being used during his youth as a reader in Korea. So, but I also argue he wasn't just reusing or transferring this convention uncritically. So he actually innovated on top of it. So by transforming it into a form of cultural self-definition and literary self-display to articulate a Korean literary tradition that was related to, but distinct from, China and Japan, while also showing off the range of his own erudition. So his novels, and this one in particular among the two, uh, represent an unusually early case of Korean literature influencing the English novel in an articulable and an identifiable way. So he wasn't just a Korean writer trying to use or master the conventions of the English language novel. He was actually, and this I think is kind of the touching point of the project, so he was actually using the heritage of Korean prose fiction's imbrication of poetry to do something that altered and expanded the Western novel as he found it. So in both Korea and the United States, commentary tends to focus on Younghill Kang's place at the beginnings of Asian American writing, rather than within the tradition of Korean writing, as I was saying. But Korean intellectuals' debates about the relationship of literary tradition to modernity also formed Kang as a writer just as much as American literary culture. So the question of whether and to what extent Korean fiction could or should influence modern Korean fiction, or traditional Korean fiction should introduce the modern form, crossing centuries, and also the question of what deserved to be called Seoul loomed really large in debates among young writers. periodical publication marked fiction as modern, and so too did taking foreign fiction from Japan or Russia or Europe as a model. One of the big touchstones here is Lee Kwang-soo's 1916 essay, 문학이란 하오, What is Literature, which is now a watershed moment, and treated Korean literature before the start of the 20th century really scathingly, as people like Andre Schmidt point out. He dismisses Korean texts and literary scientific as mere imitation of China and Korean vernacular fiction as just entertaining rather than edifying. This bottom quote here. Think how the tale of Ch'unhyangjŏn and the tale of Shin-tong have become a source of pleasure and well-being for many people. Yet although these works are excellent, we cannot call them great. But because he wants them to be, modernizing and morally edifying. In contrast, he and other writers of his time really held up people like Tolstoy as their model for distinctively modern Korean fiction. And my role model here is Hee-kyung-cho, whose work I admire a lot. He actually, Younghill Kang, interestingly, actually criticizes Lee Kwang-soo in passing in The Grass Roof, which you see here. Han Chung-pa delivers himself with the opinion that Lee Kwang-soo and Hyun Sang-yoon, here spelled in a little bit of an old-fashioned way, he was from the far north, that they could be stimulating but boring and didactic. So the phrasing suggests that Kang disagreed with Lee Kwang-soo's belief that the novel should portray aspects of life in a refined and righteous manner. Lee Kwang-soo later repaid the critique by scolding what he called the shallowness of Mr. Kang's knowledge of Korea in a December 1931 essay for 동아일보, though he approved of the Grass Roof storytelling and artistic verb. And you can kind of see this funny back and forth on this slide here. However, other writers very much supported drawing together Korean literary traditions with outside influences on modern Korean fiction. So we have evidence that Kang followed and sympathized with those conversations. For one thing, in The Grass Roof, Han Chung-pa expresses frustration with the tenor of literary conversation in intellectual circles, such as that of the real-life intellectual Choi Pa-ryong. They were only interested in the most modern thinkers. They confused the ephemeral with those of real superiority and never linked them to the past at all. He goes on to contrast this with his affinity for Han Yong-won, which becomes important in the novel's second half. And from overseas, too, we know that Kang took interest in Imhwa, which Kang's biographer Kim Ok-dong notes. And even though Im's efforts to build a modern Korean literary history postdates The Grass Roof, Kim Ok-dong speculates that Kang took interest in Imhwa's openness to literary hybridizations that would draw on Korean tradition to reinvent Western influences into something new. So here you see this quote from Im's history. The more that foreign culture's transplantation advances, the more cultural creativity matures back from inside Korea. And this too was published originally in 동아일보. It's a process of transplanted culture and native culture intensely negotiating with each other. Indeed, of native cultural history ingesting the transplanted culture. The native culture transforms its inherited appearance and advances. So Kang's sympathies, insofar as we can reconstruct them, seem to have lain with the hopes that people like Han and Im were voicing to draw Korean culture before 1900 into dialogue with new forms, new genres, and media that bore outside influence. So The Grass Roof's extensive quotation of poetry inside its prose narration, I think, represents one attempt to realize that kind of intense negotiation or ingestion that Imhwa was talking about. I take the use of sabibshi in the Kuunmong and Ch'unhyangjŏn as evidence here for how Kang would have understood what a sabibshi was. We know that he knew them because the Grass Roof mentions them, so we're on relatively solid epistemic grounds here. So in the novel, the character Han Tong-pa encounters both of these works through his unnamed uncle character, whom Han keeps calling a crazy poet. And the uncle passed the Kwago exam at some point, and so he therefore holds high rank, but he spends a lot of money and he earns little money back. The character plays a really important role for the cultural mission of this novel, partly because he's situated that way. He realizes the novel's aim of exposing its presumed Western readers to traditional Korean culture, especially that of literate elites, because he has access to so much culture around him, so and is an educated literatus and so forth. So the young Han Tongpa experiences a lot of works of Korean art by being introduced to them through this uncle, which then gives Kang, the writer, an opportunity to depict and explain those to the reader through Han Tongpa, his character's first-person narration. The uncle has a large library, which appears at convenient moments like here. And Kuunmong appears in chapter 8. Uh, when Han's uncle celebrates his Hwangak banquet, the uncle sends for, as you can see here, an orchestra of 7 or 8 pieces and several beautiful young men dancers who had been part of his household in Seoul to come perform at his family's ancestral village, the town Songbunji, so which Kang probably based on his hometown in Hamdong-namdo. There have been efforts to try to figure out exactly where it was. Among the performances, there's a dancer named Seung-ham, or Blooming Fellow, so whom he says was famed for his delicate face and exquisite physique, and performs a basically Hagak version of several scenes from the Kuunmong to musical accompaniment. Uh, and he says, Blooming Fellow entertained us for many, many hours with extracts from The Cloud Dream of the Nine, the gay and witty love story of a young Buddhist monk who grew tired of the monastic life. He then goes on to summarize the Kuunmong's plot. Uh, the Kuunmong, it's worth noting, had appeared in Gale's English translation in 1922, but it's not totally clear whether Kang was aware of it or not. And so it's unclear so whether the fact that he decided to translate the title the same way is just coincidence, or whether he's borrowing the translation of the title from Gale. Anyway, we can infer from more details in this scene that he knew the Kuunmong in writing too. In later on in this passage, I'm not sure that I put this on a slide. I apologize if I didn't. Oh yeah, it's here. He alludes to Kim Manjul directly as a Korean Bakato who wrote the Kuunmong many centuries ago to entertain his mother, whom he loved very dearly. So the passage retells the well-known tradition, which holds that Kim Nam-jung wrote the story to keep up his mother's spirits when the family fell into King Sukjong's disfavor and had to go into exile. And so crucially, by using the verb wrote here, Kang is unfolding inside the novel the knowledge that the performance's source was originally a written narrative. So it's ultra clear that Kang Young-hil had access to this fact. So presuming that Han's uncle's large library of works in both vernacular Korean and Hanmun had some kind of real-world counterpart, Kang probably would have been able to consult a version of the Kuunmong in that library and would have encountered Sabibshi through that vector. Incidentally, what we know of the oral performance of such narratives as Gagik also suggests that there was some kind of performance of inset poetry in spoken form, which people tend to call a sabib gayo in the literature. But it's unclear, obviously, whether that would have been an aspect of the performance that Kang is imagining here. Korean scholars have researched Sapipsi so very thoroughly, to a degree that is remarkable, given that almost no one seems to have mentioned the phenomenon by that name in English. For the present topic, the key point from the research that I'd like to bring over is that the majority of the inset poems in Kuunmong play a dynamic role inside the plot. They're not just ornamental. They're not just extra diegetic kind of comment of the narrator on what's happening. But they actually perform specific functions, which scholars like Shinun-gyong, whose work I really admire a lot on this, categorize as things like opportunities for lovers to meet, lovers' responses to each other, demonstrations of scholarly proficiency, confirming a character's identity, and so on and so forth. Uh, Another scholar on this list, Chon Hongdae, also pointed out a long time ago that the use of poetry generally serves as metapoetic criticism too. And Lee Chang-ki, in this second article on the list, also adds that they often have a foreshadowing function. So the point is that the model of inset poetry, so that you get if you're an alert reader, so is that of poetry functioning dynamically inside a narrative. It's not just decorative. So carefully reading the Ch'unhyangjŏn and what Kang does with that reveals the further fact so that he had in the Ch'unhyangjŏn a model for using vernacular Korean poetry also as sabipsi, not just hanshi, as is the case in Kuunmong. So the Ch'unhyangjŏn exists in both kinds of versions, and it's pretty clear from context that the grass roof is depicting the latter. So in chapter 9 of the novel, Han's uncle introduces Han Chongpa to a kiseng whose name is Meja, or Plum Child, who owns at her house a copy of the Ch'unhyangjŏn, together with other unnamed novels, which is interesting. She calls it The Story of Spring Perfume and of Master Plum, a novel which American missionaries have called obscene and other native Korean works. Scholars somewhat despise these, but Plum Child read the native novels all the time, reveling in the stories of beautiful and learned concubines. So the fact that he's calling these native Korean works seems to pinpoint that they're vernacular Korean, not Hanwon tellings. And this whole scene gels with the conventional understanding that literate women were far more likely to be reading vernacular Korean rather than Hanwon. Though Han Chongpa actually does note of this character, interestingly, that in addition to writing in native Korean, she quote, even knew many Chinese characters, so which also fits with our knowledge of Hanwon knowledge among Kiseng. So if Kang, like Meta, knew vernacular tellings of Ch'unhyangjŏn, he likely encountered Korean language verse forms as sabipsi. So the Namwon Gosa version of Ch'unhyangjŏn, which offers the fullest version of Ch'unhyangjŏn that survives, and is probably from about the 1860s, contains a bunch of different verse forms. They were probably written down because their inclusion in the narration came from performances as pansori or taryong. Broadly speaking, so they fall into the categories of sasa shicho, kasa, and folk songs. And even if he knew some other version that was less encyclopedic, he probably would have been comfortable with the idea of integrating these into narrative fabric. It's worth noting, again, returning to Lee Kwang-soo and Munakiran Hao, that the idea of having oral and musical performance inside a long narrative was so conspicuous in the early 20th century that Lee Kwang-soo actually felt that he had to scold common people for not making a distinction between the two. He said, in Korea, people call oral stories novels and storytellers novelists, but this only illustrates their ignorance. Incredibly kind of condescending. So in this light, he may have imagined what he was doing, adapting sabipsi in the grass roof, as implying kind of the ghost of musical performance, partly novel, partly a kind of intercultural opera. So the way that he depicts both of these 고전소설 in the grass roof, makes it possible to say for certain that he had strong models from the 고전소설 for the inclusion of poetry within the narrative structure of extended prose fiction. And he probably knew a bunch of others as well that aren't depicted here. But as I said at the beginning, he's not just adopting these generic conventions uncritically. So he actually does something different from traditional Korean prose fiction. fiction. He's mixing poetry and prose not just on the active dynamic level of the characters, but he also does it on the level of the retrospective first person narrator. So the fusion of functional poetry insertion together with autobiographical reminiscing just brings into the novel a huge amount of translation. Uh, and I think it represents a kind of eccentric attempt to preserve and convey. So, but it's important to remember, Kang at the time felt to be endangered poetry in his time and place. He's putting this in the vessel of the novel, so, and bringing it into English, uh, partly so because the question of the Korean literary future is itself somewhat in question so at this point in time, and also because he, as an emigre in the English speaking world, so can both preserve it by bringing it into English to a broader world audience and make a literary case for the independent cultural existence of Korea to those American readers. So, regarding the book itself, of those 65 poems inside the narrative of The Grass Roof, 42 of them are poems of Korean origin, 10 of them are poems from China, 5 of them are songs originally in Japanese, and just one of them was originally written in English. And out of the Korean poems, 23 are shijol, 4 are hansi, so 2 he kind of ambiguously calls folk songs, and 7 of them are poems by Han Myung-woo, which at that point were contemporary poetry. And the 6 that are left over, either Kang doesn't say what they are, and I or previous scholar translators could not match them with a particular source. So, because he presents all of these in his own translations, you have to back identify them. And there's a really good article by a scholar named Kang Hae-jung that does this, that builds also off earlier Korean translations of these poems in the first full translation done by Chang Moon-pyong. Uh, and like I said, they generally fall into two categories. So one is the narrator outside. Narrative theorists would call this heterodiegetic. Excuse the jargon. And the other characters talking to each other in poetry, we would call the diegetic level. So generally, in The Grass Roof, the 20 poems that the narrator's voice introduces are playing some kind of descriptive role. They're expanding or commenting on an aspect of the narrated scene, but they're retrospective and they don't influence anything. So here's an example. In chapter 5, sorry, I missed some slides here. In chapter 5, in the middle of describing himself and other children catching dragonflies, he suddenly adds a Sasa Shichol by Lee Yeon-sin on the same subject. And you see the texture of that here. He has the narration, my grandmother's eyes were shining, her mood was that of the old Korean poem. And then all of a sudden, the narrator launches into the full poem, quotes the whole thing. Then we have a leaving gesture. The pine to the Oriental is the symbol of immortality, my grandmother, and we return to the texture of the story. So even though the narrator uses the past tense to describe the main action in the plot, he always cites poems in the present tense, usually because some event in the plot is serving as a pretext for the quotation, like past memories are spontaneously calling the poem to mind. There are particular phrases that mark out this gesture. There's like, as, remind of. There's the structure of simile around these. The poems do play a decorative function, but they also serve the interest of letting Kang broaden his portrait of Korean culture by weaving the text, weaving into the text an actual piece of its literature. They also give the opportunity to expose or suggest the interior mental states of the characters. So in this next example, so for instance, I'm sorry, so I skipped over an example. So this was the uh, You know what? I forgot one. Please forgive me. This was the example, so that was supposed to go with my previous explanation. Uh, Everyone must have been quite confused earlier. And so here we have the transition in and out. Um, the comment that I wanted to offer on this was that the poem's placement is explaining that Han's grandmother is explaining Han's grandmother's otherwise unmanifested emotional state. It's clarifying the character's inner life where affect otherwise doesn't show externally, apart from her eyes. Um, but it does offer retrospective interpretation. It's not emanating from the grandmother's character. Uh, it's also worth noting that that mention of national troubles in the staging words up here uh, also contrasts the mood being depicted with the political context of Japanese imperialism, which is a kind of touch of dramatic irony from the standpoint of the narrator. Pre-modern Korean poetry gets foiled against the intrusion of colonial modernity and with the concerns of the world's dust, so which is consistent with Kang's tendency to idealize Han Tongpa's boyhood in Korea before annexation as idyllic and peaceful, culture. Now onto the other category. We are starting to approach the end here. I'm mindful of the time, and also the issues with compression. Um, uh, the 42 inset poems that are introduced diegetically do play dynamic roles in the plot. And in that sense, they resemble the use of inset poems in the Korean classical novel more strongly. In the simplest instances, these poems play a straightforwardly descriptive function, kind of like the ones that I was talking about just above. So to take one example, we have Han Chung-pa's poet uncle talking about the moon, 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 moon. So, and then uh, uh, I am sorry. So this too, so is the one so where I uh, did not have precisely the examples so that I thought that I was going to. No, wait, here's the one. Okay. So he recites the Shicho after reflecting on the moon, spurred by the appearance of the moon. So we get this poem so talking about Libai, Ibig. Uh, Other poems, in contrast with this, play more dynamic roles. So, for example, when Han's grandfather dies, there are two inset poems that appear in quick succession, and those poems advance the action of the scene itself. Um, in this poem here, Kang takes a scene depicting Han's grandmother doing housework as an occasion to translate and incorporate the text of the folk song that she's singing. Oh, how sorry I am, how sorry I am. The wind is blowing, the wind is blowing, the rain is dripping, the rain is dripping. The texture of this is very different from the shicho, of course, and imitates the text of the folk song. I haven't been able to find an exact precedent, but it's interesting that Han was trying to incorporate a wide variety in this way. So, uh, the folk song serves tonally as part of the description of what she's doing. And the fact that it's repeating so much, it differs from the other poems. It really seems to be emphasizing that it's sung and not written, and that folk songs have kind of a life and style distinct from other more complex and less repetitive forms. So, uh, in the interest of time, so I would like to jump ahead a little bit to what I think is the richest example here. You've been a very patient online audience, and I hate to tax that patience. I also want to leave time for questions. So this is an especially interesting set of scenes. And it's with this that I would like to come to toward a conclusion. The functions of the inset poetry in the second half of the novel range especially widely. So Han Tong-pa leaves Hamgyongdo to pursue education, first in Seoul, then in Japan. Uh, some of the scenes that I glided by that quickly happen. So as he comes down from Seoul, he sells hamchi for food, an actual historical practice that we know from the Yora Ilgi. You could trade poetry for money. Um, and later on, we have the other poetry in the form of correspondence between him and hometown friends and family. But most striking, is his use of inset poetry to assert his competence not just to translate Korean poetry, but the poetry of the Sinographic cosmopolis more broadly, in a reworking of the topos of the poet prodigy throughout East Asian narrative fiction, especially in the main character of the Kuunmong, Yang So. So what you see here on the slides is that in chapter 14, he seizes on this opportunity to show off his literary Sinaitic translation skills. So he enrolls in a quote, Japanese government high school, where he embarrasses his teacher by correcting his factual mistakes in interpreting a poem. So from the Confucian text, the Kongzi Shijia, Confucius's family sayings. So his humorously pedantic exegesis illustrates both Kang's claim to literary and scholarly greatness, surpassing the Japanese, as well as the crude violence behind Japanese colonization. Uh, you see this passage here. Uh, I'll read a little bit before that. Uh, the Japanese teacher was very vague about the political situation at that time and didn't understand that the poet writing the poem wasn't actually insane. So I said, Sir, I think the meaning is this. At the time of Confucius, many poets were committing suicide because they did not like the government of their country. So, and Yu, the madman of Chu, who sang this, also grew weary of a country which was oppressed by tyranny. By means of this poem, he was warning Confucius to get out of politics and leave the dirt to the dirt. In this, I think he was not a madman, but a poet and a wise man. The teacher then called me a bad boy and a disobedient one and fingered his sword. So I kept quiet and sat down because he had a sword. So the inset poem in the Chōson traditionally served to flaunt the erudition of a character like Yang So, displaying the ability of a prodigy to execute the literary talent on which, of course, qualification for high office was predicated. But the redeployment of Sabipshi under the Japanese colonial regime here is humorous enough, even to someone who's uninformed about the context. But to a reader with any knowledge of the underlying genre convention in East Asian fiction, this whole scene speaks to the sense of a civilizational order being overturned. The deference that poetry is supposed to earn for a protagonist inside the genre of the novel, the deference that Han Tongpa does receive so when he's earning money by writing Hansi, so has been turned upside down by imperial discipline. Uh, because authority over occupied subjects must be maintained at all costs. Rather than earning high office, it earns kind of like a thumbing of the sword here. So Kang then repeats the same scene again with variations. So he gives a translation of a poem by a Tang era poet, Zhang Qi, so, which you see here. The title in Chinese is Feng Qiao Ye Po. And after that, so he again bests his same Japanese school teacher at the game of interpretation. This time, so the explanation that he gives, which I won't read, goes for 2 whole pages, what this poem is doing. Uh, he does brag, this particular poem has been completely mistranslated by all Western scholars, and so far as I know, misinterpreted by many Chinese. So it's important to set his efforts here. So in the context of all those American translators that I was mentioning earlier. So Kang is arguing here for his own privileged scholarly knowledge in a field that included, so by that point, successful and influential translations by all those people, Lafcadio O'Hearn, Arthur Waley, and so on and so forth. So by laying claim to superior expertise as an East Asian emigre translator brought up in East Asia, Kang is setting himself forward as a self-appointed bridge between American and Sinitic literary culture. which is a dynamic that started with his 1929 translations of Oriental poetry and continued into his second book in 1937. Uh, so he didn't become a second Shakespeare in the end. So, and many of the translations in the Grass Roof events mannerisms or eccentricities even after a bunch of editing. Uh, but at the same time, he really did succeed in conveying the broad letter and form of Korean poetry to a public encountering Korea for the first time, and with a technical command of English form that was pretty remarkable for a writer who had been using the language for less than a decade. Um, and I just want to share here, so one of the translations that I think does succeed best from the novel uh, as poetry, with the Korean right below it. Think of our human life, only a bundle of dreams, good things, evil things, all our dreams within dreams. But as we dwell in dreams, why not enjoy good times? What else could you do? Uh, the scholars and the Kiseng are here just contemplating what they know is the end of a Korean cultural order, so as the shadows of Japanese imperialism encroach more on them. And after all this time spent with Kang, I do still kind of believe that out of all of the contemporary translations of Shicho in the decades since, it's actually remarkably hard to think of a Shicho translation that does get much better than where this one lands us. So, thank you so much for your time. I am so sorry about the balance of the talk and needing to compress some things on the fly and gauge where we were along things, and that this ran a little bit long. But thank you so much for your attention, and I would really love to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Spencer. What a wonderful talk. I learned so much and I have so many questions myself. But before we get to the questions, let's give Spencer another round of applause. Um, as the moderator, I believe I have some control over the time. And I would like us to stick with the 30 minutes that we traditionally reserve for question and answers. What a rich and fascinating talk. I mean, I'm just grateful that we got more of you and your talk for longer than we usually have our talks. So I'm very grateful for that. So just a quick reminder to the audience of how we do our Q&As. I will run it for about 30 minutes. There are two ways to ask questions to Spencer. So first, as many of us are now familiar with Zoom, you're welcome to use the raise hand function. Come on, mic, and share your questions verbally, and we will take your questions in the order they were asked. You're also welcome to type in questions in the chat, and you can type the message to everyone. I will see the questions as they come up on chat, and I will read the questions in order that they appear out loud to everyone so we can all know what the questions are and then pose them to Spencer. So please feel free to ask the questions. I'm also happy to start with questions if our audience requires a bit more time, but I don't want to hog the floor, so to speak. So, or maybe let's see here. Wait a minute or two. Yes, Jian.
Hi. Wait, sorry. So
Hi.
can Hi.
Yeah, you're
Can I just
on.
speak into the microphone? Is that okay?
Yeah,
Thank
you
you
don't
so
have
much.
to turn on
Hi.
video. That's up
Yes.
to your comfort
Okay.
level. You're welcome to just speak.
I would love to turn on my video, but I don't look
It's
ideal right
fine.
now. So,
It's all
but
right.
Spencer, that was like so wonderful. I learned so much, and I just wanted to know a little bit more. I came in a little late to the talk, so maybe I missed this part. But so you've talked a lot about the shijo in the poetry and the grass roof, but for Asian Americanists like me, like what's more familiar is East Coast West, right? And I was just wondering if there's in your perspective, like, is there a kind of qualitative difference in the way that Shijo gets picked up or used in the grassroots versus East Coast West? Like, is there kind of a way you might compare the ways they these different texts take up uh these kind of Korean texts, or are they similar to you?
Yeah,
I just want to hear more about that. Yeah. Thank
yeah, thank you so much for the question. So the texture and use of poetry does change a lot. So, and the actual makeup of the poetry changes a lot too. I'd like to go through and make a similar table accounting for all of the poems systematically at some point. But one of the things that changes is that there's simply, while there is still a lot of poetry that's very conspicuous to anyone reading East Coast West, uh, there's relatively less of it, so which gives one a index on just how much of it there is in the grass roof. Uh, and also, it's a little bit more balanced out. So, partly due to circumstance, East Coast West is set entirely in the United States, a little bit in Canada. And there are no scenes in Korea. There are scenes of Kang interacting with Koreans and other people. So, and most frequently, so when the narrative precipitates bringing up a piece of Korean and or Hansi um, poetry, uh, then it happens in one of those contexts, or when the narrating character Han Tong-ha is thinking over something that is distinctly Korean in nature or resonance. Every once in a while, in one conspicuous place, that he does some interesting things where he compares an ancient European Greek or Latin poet to the situation of a East Asian poet. I believe in the case that I'm thinking of, it's actually Hanyu. Um, and so it does happen, but there is markedly less poetry from vernacular Korean. I think that there might be a couple pieces, but to the extent so that there is actually, I remember being struck by this, though I would be hard pressed to give you concrete numbers now, which is why I need to go refresh my memory. There is actually, I believe, more poetry translated from um, classical Chinese slash literary Semitic, so in East Coast West, than there is poetry from vernacular Korean. But also, to give credit to Jane Eam, whose article I quoted near the beginning of things. So if you were working primarily with East Goes West and seeing the epigrams, all of which come from famous Romantic and Victorian writers and so forth, you would definitely come away with the impression that Kang was far more worried about his relationship with European classical poetry than with poetry of East Asia, which is one of the things that I think the grass roof has to offer, so that it really expands that portrait.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I have I mean, I will ask a question while we're waiting for questions from the audience. One thing I was curious about, Spencer, is you are talking about the Grass Roof as sort of this hybrid novel, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about behind sort of Kang's motivation for doing this when presenting this sort of, as in your words, this traditional East Asian fiction form in English for an audience that, especially at that time, I mean, he's not writing to a lot of, Asian Americans in the US or abroad. The English language audience would require so much scaffolding to be able to read and appreciate this text. And there are many in Korea who have the same set of knowledge that he does and appreciation for sort of the pre-20th century literature and that body of knowledge that are preserving and writing, conveying that knowledge in not that kind of traditional genre form, but in other ways. And I'm wondering what you think his motivations might have been in presenting the specific genre or translating or trying to translate that genre into English and how he might have been, if at all, in conversations with, influenced by shadowboxing, perhaps, conversations going on in Korea with those who were valuing that kind of pre-20th century poetry and sort of wrestling with the same questions that he might have been.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. Also, it gives me a chance to work in some points that I think I spell out slightly more in the conclusion and had to cut for time. So it's a nice chance to get to expand. Um, uh, I viewed this argument and tried to be relatively careful, yeah, about as one about effect more so than motivation. I think that in
Mhm.
practice, so what Kang did end up doing was creating this hybrid, bringing together different sets of conventions into a novel. What that when looked at that way is really interesting and innovative. I don't think that that was necessarily in his motivational set at all. Or I do think that he was aware of making some departures from what he must have seen in other uh, uh, English language novels around him, but maybe not to the extent of him saying, aha, I'm going to take this from this tradition and this from this tradition. What I think probably happened was this. Kang, we do know, had his heart really set on being a poet, trying to achieve fame as a poet. He takes it very seriously. He invests a lot of emotion in it, from what we can tell from the recollections of others and from the early writing that we have on hand. Uh, and I suspect that it probably came as a disappointment to him that he was not able to get these translations of poetry published more widely than he did. Uh, that he was not able to break into the poetry world, so to speak. And so when he did get his chance to break in, and what stuck was the opportunity to write a novel, I suspect that he said, okay, if I get to write a novel, I'm going to stuff it with as much poetry as I possibly can. And he had invested a lot of time in translating at this point. So it fit with the matter of the novel itself. It also fit, I think, with his own desires to represent Korean culture on a broader world stage. And so, out of convenience, so he kind of let poetry translations hijack the texture of the novel in a way that I'm sure to his mind he had a generic precedent for doing. So from the form of the novels that he knew, so in Korean, and let him say, you know what? If the novels that I grew up in this part of the world did this, then its cognate genre on this other side of the world surely can make room for poetry salted in here and there as well. Um, I also think that other people have kind of remarked on this as a phenomenon of early diasporic writing. I don't think that Kang conceived of himself necessarily as diasporic at this point in time. If anything, I think he understood himself to be in a kind of exile in the 1930s, leading up to his failed campaign so to try to receive citizenship in the US by a private bill. Uh, but I think that he fell into the dynamic where, in the process of explaining a homeland culture to a culture in the global metropolis, so he ended up essentializing and valorizing all of those things that to many Korean writers who were his contemporaries trying to think of what it meant to view building a new literary form, build up the Chåson as a distinctively modern form. That they, I won't say that they did not, because there are examples like what comes to mind? 메밀꽃이 필 무렵, uh, the 나혜석, is it Guam? Um, pieces of fiction so from that early picture so that do have and admit more aspects of traditional Korean life, less focus on the industrial, less focus on the way that agriculture had changed, to something quite different and disturbing in its time, as you find in, say, Kang Kyung-e. Um, uh, and uh, or Kim Yoo-dong. Uh, but I think that it came out different. So partly because, and this is the other thing that I would tack on, so to the answer to your second question. Uh, I think that both to himself and to the world, Kang was deeply invested in trying to raise sympathy for Korea and its plight as a colony of Japan. So by depicting late Joseon culture as prelapsarian, uh, and so he depicts the culture so very positively. He is concerned to draw out the idea or depict Korean culture prior to annexation as one of a kind of rural happy bliss in some ways, or at least a functioning autonomous culture that did not deserve to be taken over and have modernity imposed on it. So he ends up playing up very sympathetically all of these images of Korean culture. So because he believes in his calculations, so that it will play well, so with the audience to which he wants to appeal, in a way that Korean writers writing for a primarily domestic linguistic audience, uh, it was the opposite of what they felt would be interesting and convey as a modern and sympathetic to their main readers, or at least that's the read that I have at this moment.
Yeah, no, super fascinating because generally, I mean, this is the conventional understanding and very like overgeneralizing here, but generally the desire to become modern in the literary sphere is a lot of writers getting that modernity through Japanese language or through translations into Japanese and then, retranslations into Korean, trying to embrace the Western forms and to show that Korea has modern fiction just as, comparable to those being written by contemporaries in the West. So that's a very interesting take. We do have a long question from one of the audience members in the chat, and I'm going to read it out loud. From Sunbin Lee, she says, "Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. My apologies for not being able to speak aloud. I have two questions. First is on the reception and legacy of Kang's performance of literary expertise via Inset poetry. Would you say that there are Asian American, or post-colonial writers who cite or allude to the grass roof as a predecessor in a writer or scholar's transcultural self-fashioning? I wonder if Kang can serve as a starting point for another kind of literary genealogy, one of the East Asian migrant writer as mediator of pre-modern traditional Asian poetic forms across languages." And then they add, "My background is in English American poetry, and I'm generally interested in composite prose slash verse forms in English, late 18th and 19th century British naturalists. Poets, Gothic novelists all use the insertion of poetry in longer prose genres. I wonder if Kang would have had exposure to these works and also some modernist hybrid works in English that intermix poems and prose. I wouldn't suppose these as a determining quote unquote Western influence, but it's fascinating to see prose slash poetry genres across different cultures in the early 20th century."
Yeah. So I think absolutely to the first. Uh, um, I will say so. So there's a positive and there is a more open-ended answer to this question. The first is that especially after Kang's revival, there has been a spate of within the past 5 or 10 years or so more more contemporary Asian and Asian American writers uh, viewing and alluding to Kang generally, and with Kang aspects of the grass roof as part of a tradition, so that they perceive. I think that most notably relatively early in this trend, which has actually played out largely during the time that I've been working on Kang. So Ed Park develops an interest in Kang and writes a novel, writes an article that's still pretty widely read on Kang for the New York Review of Books. Alexander Chee got very interested in Younghill Kang for various reasons and has kind of been here and there spreading word bit by bit since then. So I also think that for the interplay of scholarship and um, literary writers here is also a complex one in that scholars who are themselves engaged in scholarly forms of creative writing, oftentimes involving translation, were definitely aware of these. And in that tradition, so I would say that the most notable people were the poet Ko Won, excuse me, not, yes, Ko Won, who picks up the thread of trying to translate contemporary Korean poetry into English in the 1960s under the same auspices that Richard E. Kim, another writer in whom I'm interested, that enters American literary circulation. So is not as successful at Kong at doing so, partly because he didn't have the matrix of a popular novel in which to succeed at doing that. But does get it kind of out there and in print. And also starting maybe a little bit later, and then with more ultimate long-term success because he was sheltered by the Academy, Peter Huxley Lee, whom, of course, many people in a chat like this will know and be aware of. So, Lee knew of Kong's legacy and the fact that he was out there. In some ways, I think that their formations were more similar to each other than to other parts of the generation of post 1965 Korean migrants to the United States. Uh, and the sense of being part of a shared project in that regard is pronounced. But the negative side of this answer is, did anyone pick up the thread of The Grass Roof? As a novel with an imbrication of prose narrative and inset poetry, as a model for their own creative project? No, it's not one of those things that one comes across. And it would be fascinating if it had, but I have just not come across any such evidence. And actually, the way that I wind up the print version of this is that I actually think that, insofar as, scholars are literary critics and literary critics have any, ability to encourage writers to write a certain kind of thing, I think that it would be fascinating if someone started to view this as a Asian emigres writers attempt to draw two different parts of the global fictional tradition together as a possible formal model for their own new pieces of experimental writing. And it is kind of my dream that maybe someone will do exactly that. But that's still kind of yet unrealized potential on my part. And to respond to the second part of your question, regarding influences, there definitely are other forms of imbrication of verse with prose in the texture of Western fictional genres, the ones that you mentioned. Also, the long before this, fictions like Philip Sidney's Arcadia does this, other kind of early modern fictions, all the way into, you catch hints of this in Balzac as well. A novel like Lost Illusions, it involves kind of quotations of bits of what's supposed to be Lucien's poetry in the texture of the novel as a plot device. But you never come across it to the quite. I hate to say never, but so in my opinion, so compared with the scale so that it happens so in East Asian traditional fiction, and here Lee-Lenfield, whom I mentioned earlier, so really has been one of my guides, and I think she's a fantastic scholar of this tradition. Um, that it rarely happens with the density or the consistencies or kind of the cultivations of very specific um, genre conventions around this in quite the same way. Though you're right, that certain forms of epistolary and Gothic novel are kind of the jumping to memory now, so that maybe I should have thought. Certainly, Kang is an eclectic enough reader, so and more interested in those things that hold kind of status in his literary world than he is interested in experimental literature of the kind unfolding in modernism at that time. So to that extent, it is very plausible to me that he would have come across those kinds of works. Yes, I see a hand,
Yes, we
Max.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
Max will be no, that's fine. I just wanted to let everyone else know the time. Max will probably be our last question. And just a quick reminder, after the last question, our official schedule will end, but if people have questions or chats, we're gonna keep the Zoom room open for sort of informal chats as we would if we were meeting in real time for about 10-15 minutes afterwards. So this will be the official last question for the Q&A. But if you'd like to stay behind and chat with Spencer, we do reserve a bit of time at the end. All right. And with that, we will jump to Max.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for your lovely talk. I wonder if you would expand a little on the nature of Kang's self-consciousness regarding the novel form in relation to the poetic form. I know that, for instance, in The Grass Roof, Kang talks about the physical inscription of poetry on the natural landscape, like leaves and rocks. And I wonder if there's some sort of analogy that could be drawn between that willingness to allow the kind of the poetic text to spill onto the outer world and Kang's investment in inscribing the poem into kind of the narrative world of the novel? And is there a significance in that approach's contrast with other kind of more overtly modern Korean writers such as Lee Kwang-soo, who are trying to write a novel that is presumably more self-contained? So is there a difference in the novelistic project of Kang and other kind of more quote unquote native non-diaspora Korean writers? And what does that imply for Kang's relation to the modern Korean literary movement?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Uh, I do think that you catch hints of meta-novelistic discussion of what is it to write a novel in a couple of passages, including the ones that I quoted around introducing the image of the Kuunmong and Ch'unhyangjån so into the fabric of the story. Uh, the most notable bit of that is that he does, in fact, call them novels. Uh, it's the word that he chooses, despite the fact that other words would have been available, and that while there are definitely other people going around referring to such narratives from before the Kabomyeon as Sosar, who are his contemporaries. So at the same time, he chooses this word that makes those works continuous with and analogous to the counterparts that he must have come across so during his education in Canada at Boston University and at Harvard. Uh, so he is choosing to make the structural analogy that kind of cultural translation, I suppose one could call it, uh, and say these forms are the same. When in fact, for certain people and in certain questions, so that was not necessarily obvious. So and also the term 소설 or shosetsu so was at that point still a relative newcomer to Korean via, I believe, Japanese, although people can check my facts on that and I would stand to be corrected. Um, and so I think that the point is that he does see himself as someone who is, again, the way that he alludes to the story of Kim Man-jung in exile, so writing for entertainment. So I think that he understands himself to be a kind of exile, writing so as to be able to do something consequential so for Korea while he is outside of Korea. And from that historical position, not knowing whether there will be a Korea for him to return to ever from the vantage of, say, 1931. Uh, and um, so I think that the question of what is a novel and what is this vessel such that it has mass standing in the West that's capable of delivering me a mass audience, uh, and how can I best use it to my advantage? So it creates the set of pressures that causes him to do some of the strange things he does. That's how I would put it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone. This is the end of the Q&A and end of the event. I'd like to thank Spencer again for presenting their really fascinating research, oversharing with us, and allowing us to, pick at his brain for the full 30 minutes of Q&A. I'd like to also thank every single participant in today's Zoom meeting. Thank you for your questions and your meaningful feedback. If you have additional questions or comments to Spencer, I encourage that you reach out to them. Their email
Yes,
and their
please do.
bio are in the chat. So, and we have received the okay to share these with you. So feel free to reach out to them for additional conversations beyond the event today. Um, and this, as I mentioned at the beginning, this talk and the Q&A have been recorded. We are going to stop the recording now. The recording is available on YouTube, or it'll be made available on YouTube alongside the series of Zoom talks that we have hosted here at Chōson History Society. So be sure to check us out in addition to Spencer's forthcoming article on which this talk was based. Again, we thank you for your time and effort for being here for the talk, and we really appreciate once again the engagement that you've had with Spencer and their research. We hope that as audience members, you'll join us again for future events hosted by us, the Chōson History Society. Be sure to visit our website and check us out. There's a list of events you can sign up for to get newsletters and alerts if you are not on that list already. Thank you, everyone. And I would
Thank you
just
so much
like
to everyone for coming.
Yes. And I'd just like to remind you, we're going to stop the recording now, and the formal program is over, but we're going to keep the room open for about 10-15 minutes. If people want to chat informally with Spencer before we sign off for the evening. All right.